March 6th, 1945. The streets of Cologne echo with the thunder of tank treads grinding against cobblestone. Smoke drifts between bombed-out buildings like ghosts of a dying war. Inside the turret of a Sherman tank, a soft-spoken gunner named Clarence Smoyer peers through his periscope, scanning the rubble-strewn intersection ahead. His hands rest steady on the controls, fingers blackened with grease and gunpowder. He doesn't know it yet, but in the next few minutes, his shots will be captured on film and broadcast across America, turning him into the most famous tank gunner of World War II. But this story isn't really about fame, it's about precision. It's about a machine that the world called clumsy, inaccurate, a death trap on tracks. And it's about the men who proved that reputation dead wrong. Because while the critics mocked the Sherman's aim, gunners like Clarence were turning their tanks into surgical instruments of war. They weren't just firing shells, they were rewriting history, one perfect shot at a time. The Sherman tank had a problem, at least that's what everyone said. By 1944, stories were spreading through the ranks like wildfire, tales of Sherman rounds bouncing harmlessly off German armour. Reports of entire tank battalions destroyed in single engagements, numbers that made your blood run cold. The 3rd Armoured Division alone lost 648 Sherman tanks completely destroyed in combat, with another 700 knocked out and repaired. That was a loss rate of 580%. More tanks destroyed than they started with. The mathematics of carnage. But here's what those statistics didn't tell you. They didn't account for the ground gained, the missions accomplished, the lives saved. They didn't measure the terror in German voices when they heard the distinctive growl of Sherman engines approaching. And they certainly didn't capture what happened when you put the right gunner behind the right gun at the right moment. Because the Sherman wasn't failing. The Sherman was learning, and so were its crews. The reputation started in the hedgerows of Normandy, where visibility was measured in yards and death lurked behind every earthen wall. American tank commanders found themselves in a nightmare of close-quarters combat, where German Panzerfausts and hidden anti-tank guns turned every advance into a gamble. The Bocage country was a maze of ancient field boundaries, thick with vegetation, perfect for ambushes. Sherman crews would round a corner and find themselves face to face with a German Panther at 50 yards. The first shot usually decided everything. That's where the stories began. A Sherman would turn the corner of a farmhouse and fire 3 rounds at the front of a Panther. All 3 would bounce off like pebbles thrown at a castle wall. The Sherman would reverse, trying to find cover, only to take a devastating hit that penetrated clean through 2 stone walls and the tank's armour. The crew that survived would tell the story. The ones that didn't became statistics. Word spread fast through the armoured divisions. The Sherman can't penetrate German armour. The Sherman is outgunned. The Sherman will get you killed. But what the stories didn't mention was the context, the tactical situation, the fact that most of these encounters were happening at point-blank range in terrain that favoured the defender. They didn't talk about the stabilisation system that no other tank in the world possessed. They didn't mention the fire control advantages that American engineers had built into every turret. The Sherman was equipped with something revolutionary for its time, a gyroscopic stabilizer that kept the main gun level even while the tank was moving at 15 miles per hour. This wasn't just an engineering marvel, it was a combat multiplier. While German tanks had to stop completely to take an accurate shot, Sherman crews could engage targets on the move. The system gave them a 70% hit probability at ranges between 300 and 1,200 yards. No other tank in the war could match that moving accuracy. But the stabilizer was misunderstood, underused, often disabled by crews who didn't trust the technology. British units receiving Sherman tanks through Lend-Lease frequently removed the system entirely. American crews rushed into combat with insufficient training, often didn't know how to use it properly. Maintenance was poor. The delicate gyroscopes required care that field mechanics couldn't always provide. In some units, crews swore by the stabilization. In others, they cursed it as unreliable. The truth was more complex than the reputation. Tank versus tank combat in Europe typically happened at ranges of 800 to 900 yards. Not the knife-fighting distances of the bocage, but not the long-range duels that favoured heavy German armour either. At these medium ranges, the Sherman's advantages began to show. The commander could override the gunner's controls and slew the turret directly onto target. German tanks lacked this capability. The gunner could switch between wide-angle and magnified views instantly. The fire control system was faster, more responsive, more intuitive than anything the Wehrmacht fielded. When conditions were right, when the crew was trained, when the equipment worked as designed, something magical happened. The Sherman became a precision instrument. A good gunner working with an experienced loader could fire 2 or 3 aimed shots in the time it took a German crew to reload once. Speed of engagement often mattered more than thickness of armour. The tank that fired first usually won. This wasn't theoretical. Combat reports documented case after case of Sherman crews outgunning supposedly superior German tanks. Tigers that fired first and missed, then died under a rapid barrage of American shells. Panthers that couldn't traverse their turrets fast enough to track a circling Sherman. The kill ratios told a different story than the propaganda. When American tank units engaged German armour in open country with proper tactics and training, they won more often than they lost, but individual excellence could transcend even the best equipment. That's where gunners like Clarence Smoyer entered the story. Before the war, he was just another farm boy from Pennsylvania. Quiet, unassuming, the kind of young man who preferred listening to talking. When he enlisted, he figured he'd end up in the infantry like everyone else. Instead, the army put him in a tank. His first gunnery test was almost an accident. During training exercises on the coast, the battalion held a competition among the loaders. Targets the size of tables set up on sand dunes 1,000 yards away. 8 shots, 8 targets. Clarence had never considered himself particularly skilled with weapons, but when his turn came, something clicked. 8 shots, 8 hits. Perfect score. His instructors said he had natural ability. He just shrugged and went back to loading shells. The pattern would repeat throughout his service. Quiet competence that bordered on the supernatural. In training, his scores consistently topped the charts. In combat, his first shots were almost always hits. Other gunners would ask him for advice. He'd just say, shoot fast and shoot straight, as if precision were a simple matter of wanting it badly enough. But there was more to it than desire. There was an understanding of the machine, a feel for the gun, an intuitive grasp of trajectory and timing that couldn't be taught in any manual. What made gunners like Clarence special wasn't just their individual skill. It was their ability to unlock the Sherman's true potential. They understood that the tank's reputation was built on its failures, not its capabilities. They knew that in the right hands, with the right tactics, at the right moment, a Sherman could outfight anything on the battlefield. They turned a machine that critics called clumsy into a surgical instrument of war. The stage was being set for something unprecedented. Across Europe, Sherman crews were discovering what their tanks could really do when pushed to the limit. The bocage was behind them now. The open country ahead would tell a different story. And gunners like Clarence Smoyer were about to prove that sometimes the difference between legend and reality is nothing more than one perfect shot. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It came in fragments, scattered across 100 battlefields, written in smoke and steel, and the quiet satisfaction of a shot that found its mark. By the winter of 1944, something had shifted in the American armoured divisions. The crews weren't just surviving anymore, they were hunting. Staff Sergeant Joe Ekins proved it on a summer morning in Normandy. 5 shots, 3 Tiger tanks destroyed. The most feared machines in the German arsenal reduced to burning hulks by a gunner who had fired his first combat rounds that very day. His Sherman Firefly had been ready for only 6 weeks. He'd taken it to the firing range exactly once. But when the moment came, when the crosshairs settled on that massive Tiger silhouette, muscle memory and instinct took over. The first round punched through the side armour like paper. The second found the ammunition storage, The third, Tiger never had a chance to fire back. What the world didn't understand was that stories like Ekin's weren't accidents. They were the natural result of a system that had been misunderstood from the beginning. The Sherman wasn't designed to be a heavy tank destroyer. It was built to be a cavalry mount, a breakthrough weapon, a machine that could move fast, hit hard, and keep fighting. The complaints about thin armour missed the point entirely. Speed was armour. Accuracy was armour. The ability to see the enemy first, fire first, and move to a new position before return fire arrived, that was the Sherman's true protection. Combat statistics began telling a different story as 1944 wore on. American tank units that had struggled in the confined spaces of the bocage were now operating in open country, where their advantages could shine. The numbers were stark. In tank versus tank engagements, Sherman crews were getting the first shot off in 70% of encounters. Their rapid-fire capability meant that even when German crews survived the initial impact, they rarely got a chance for effective return fire. A good Sherman gunner could put 3 rounds downrange in the time it took a Tiger crew to reload once. The psychological impact was devastating. German tank commanders who had grown accustomed to dominating every encounter suddenly found themselves outmatched. Radio intercepts captured their confusion. "The Americans are firing too fast," officer reported. "We cannot one Panzer keep up with their rate of fire." Another transmission crackling with static and fear. "They are hitting us at ranges we did not think possible. Request immediate withdrawal." But the real revolution was happening at the individual level, in the minds and hands of gunners who had learned to think like snipers. They studied their targets like hunters tracking prey. They memorized the weak points of every German tank, the vulnerable spots where American shells could penetrate even the heaviest armor. Side armor below the turret ring, the junction between hull and turret, the thin steel around the driver's vision ports. Knowledge became ammunition. Technical Sergeant Mike Colby discovered this during the advance toward the Rhine. His Sherman crew had been assigned to support an infantry attack on a fortified village. German resistance was fierce, concentrated around a church tower where spotters were directing artillery fire onto American positions. The solution seemed simple. Put a high explosive round through the tower window. Silence the observers. But the range was extreme, nearly 1,500 yards, well beyond what the manual said was effective for the 75mm gun. The target was small, maybe 3 feet wide. The wind was gusting unpredictably. Every factor argued against attempting the shot. Colby studied the problem through his periscope, calculating wind drift and shell drop like an artillery officer planning a barrage. He adjusted his aim point 6 feet to the right and 4 feet high, compensating for conditions that would have sent most rounds sailing wide of the mark. The shell struck the center of the window opening. The explosion silenced the German spotters instantly and broke the back of the village's defense. Infantry advanced under cover of smoke while Colby's crew reloaded and searched for their next target. Word of the shot spread through the battalion within hours. Impossible accuracy at impossible range. The Sherman that shot like a sniper rifle. These individual acts of precision were adding up to something larger. A reputation that began to precede the American arm reports from later divisions wherever they went. German intelligence 1944 show a marked change in tone. Earlier assessments had dismissed American tank crews as poorly trained and overly reliant on numbers. Now the report spoke of exceptional gunnery skills and devastating accuracy at extended ranges. The Sherman was no longer seen as a target. It was becoming a threat. The equipment itself was evolving too. Field modifications spread from crew to crew, unit to unit, as tankers discovered ways to enhance their already impressive capabilities. Gunners learned to fine-tune their periscopes for maximum clarity. Loaders developed techniques for faster ammunition handling that shaved precious seconds off reload times. Commanders experimented with new tactics that maximized the Sherman's strengths while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. One innovation came from an unlikely source. Corporal Danny Kowalski, a former auto mechanic from Detroit, noticed that his tank stabilizer was running rough during a maintenance check. Instead of reporting it for repair, he decided to investigate. What he found changed everything. The gyroscope housing had accumulated months of dirt and debris, throwing off the delicate balance that kept the gun steady. But when he cleaned it properly, really cleaned it down to the molecular level, the stabilizer didn't just work better than before, it worked better than it ever had. The gun held rock steady even at 20 miles per hour over rough terrain. Shots that should have been impossible became routine. Kowalski shared his discovery with other crews, and soon every Sherman in the battalion was receiving the same treatment. Accuracy rates improved across the board. What had been dismissed as unreliable technology became the foundation of American gunnery superiority. By early 1945, the transformation was complete. The Sherman tank that had entered the war with a reputation for mechanical reliability but questionable combat effectiveness had become something entirely different. A precision instrument in the hands of crews who understood its capabilities. The critics who had mocked its aim were eating their words as American gunners demonstrated accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. The stage was set for the ultimate test. Urban combat in the heart of Germany, where every shot mattered and there was no room for error. Where a soft-spoken farm boy named Clarence Smoyer would prove once and for all that the Sherman's aim was only as good as the man behind the gun. And on the streets of Cologne, with cameras rolling and the world watching, that would turn out to be very good indeed. The morning of March 6th arrived grey and cold in Cologne. The ancient cathedral city, once a jewel of the Rhine, now lay broken under the weight of Allied bombing. Streets that had echoed with commerce for 1,000 years were choked with rubble. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, painting the sky the colour of old blood. Through this urban wasteland, American armour was advancing block by bloody block. Clarence Smoyer's Sherman, call sign Eagle 7, rumbled through the debris-strewn streets with mechanical determination. The tank's steel tracks bit into broken concrete and twisted metal, grinding forward with the inexorable patience of a machine built for war. Inside the turret, Clarence adjusted his periscope and scanned the ruins ahead. His breath came in short puffs in the cold air. The heater had broken 3 days ago, and no one had found time to fix it. Behind him, his loader, Tommy Morrison, was stacking rounds with practiced efficiency. High explosive for buildings, armour-piercing for anything that looked like it might shoot back. The radio crackled with reports from other tanks in the column. Movement in the windows ahead. Possible anti-tank gun in the church tower. Eyes open, stay alert. The usual chatter of men moving through hostile territory. But something felt different today. Maybe it was the cameras. A combat photographer named Jim Bates had attached himself to their tank the night before, carrying equipment that looked heavier than most infantry weapons. He wanted to document urban tank warfare, he said. Show the folks back home what it was really like. Clarence didn't mind the extra weight, but he wondered if having a camera pointed at you changed the way you fought. The column slowed as they approached a major intersection. Intelligence reported German armour in the area, but nothing specific. Could be a single Panzerfaust team hiding in a basement. Could be a company of Panthers waiting in ambush. In urban fighting, you never knew until the shooting started. The lead Sherman nosed around the corner cautiously, commander's head barely visible above the hatch. "All clear," came the radio call. "Move up." That's when Clarence saw it. A flash of movement in his peripheral vision, caught in the edge of his periscope. He swiveled the sight left and felt his stomach drop. There, not 200 yards away, a German Panther was backing out of an alley between two bombed buildings. Its long gun was already traversing toward the American column. The crew had been waiting, probably for hours, letting the lead elements pass so they could hit the formation from the side. Clarence's hands moved without conscious thought. Years of training compressed into a single moment of pure reaction. Traverse left. Target acquired. Range estimated. 200 yards stationary target. Broadside shot. The Panther was still moving, its crew unaware they had been spotted. In seconds, they would complete their turn and bring that devastating 75mm gun to bear on the American tanks, bunched in the narrow street. Time slowed to the pace of heartbeats. Clarence could hear his own breathing, amplified inside the cramped turret. the whir of the turret motor as the gun came on target, the mechanical click as Tommy loaded an armour-piercing round, the slight vibration through the tank's hull as the engine maintained its idle. Every sensation heightened, crystallised, burned into memory. The crosshairs settled on the Panther's side armour, just below the turret ring. The sweet spot. The place where American shells could penetrate even the heaviest German armour if the angle was right and the range was close. Clarence had made this shot a dozen times in training, 100 times in his mind. But never with cameras rolling, never with the weight of reputation pressing down like gravity. He squeezed the trigger. The Sherman bucked as the 75mm gun fired, flame and smoke erupting from the barrel. The armour-piercing round crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, a streak of hardened steel moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It struck the Panther exactly where Clarence had aimed, punching through the side armour with a sound like thunder. The German tank shuddered, stopped, and began to smoke. Through his periscope, Clarence could see the crew bailing out, stumbling away from their dying machine. The Panther's ammunition began cooking off, secondary explosions that shook the ground and sent debris raining down on the street. In less than 10 seconds, one of Germany's most feared weapons had been reduced to burning scrap. But Clarence wasn't finished. Training and instinct told him to keep scanning, keep hunting. One tank was never alone. As if summoned by his suspicion, a second Panther nosed around a corner 3 blocks away. This one was moving fast, trying to escape before it shared its partner's fate. Range was longer now, maybe 400 yards. The target was moving, presenting only its frontal armour. A much more difficult shot. Tommy had already loaded another round, high explosive this time, in case they needed to engage infantry positions. Clarence called for armour piercing and waited while his loader swapped out the shell. Precious seconds ticking away while the German tank gathered speed. The Panther was heading for cover behind a pile of rubble that would mask it from American fire. Clarence led the target, calculating speed and distance and the trajectory of his shell. The Panther was moving at perhaps 15 miles per hour over broken ground. In 5 seconds, it would reach safety. In 4 seconds, it would be gone. Clarence fired on the count of 3. This shot was different. Longer range moving target, the mathematics of ballistics stretched to their limit. The round flew true but struck the Panther's glacis plate, the sloped frontal armour that was designed to deflect exactly this kind of attack. For a moment, nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the German tank's engine compartment. The round hadn't penetrated, but the impact had damaged something vital. The Panther coasted to a stop, its crew scrambling to evacuate before the fuel tanks exploded. 2 shots, 2 kills. In less than a minute, Clarence Smoyer had destroyed a German ambush that could have devastated the American column. The radio exploded with congratulations and combat reports. Other crews called in their positions, their status, their ammunition counts. But through it all, Clarence sat quietly in his gunner's seat, already scanning for the next threat. Jim Bates, the combat photographer, was practically vibrating with excitement. He had captured the entire engagement on film, from the first muzzle flash to the final explosion. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he requested permission to document tank warfare. Real combat, real heroes, the kind of footage that would show America what its boys were doing in the ruins of Germany. What Bates didn't realise was that he had witnessed something far more significant than a single tank engagement. He had documented the moment when the Sherman tank's reputation finally caught of training had technological up with reality. When years' innovation and hard-won combat experience crystallised into perfect execution. The cameras had captured not just Clarence's shots, but the vindication of every crew that had ever been told their tank wasn't good enough. The footage would reach American newsreels within weeks. Audiences in theatres across the country would watch a quiet farm boy from Pennsylvania demonstrate precision that professional marksmen could only dream of. They would see the Sherman tank not as a mechanical compromise, but as a weapon system that had evolved far beyond its original design parameters. In the hands of the right crew, it had become something approaching perfection. But the real impact wouldn't be measured in newspaper headlines or radio broadcasts. It would be felt in the morale of crews still fighting, still pushing deeper into Germany, still facing critics who question their equipment and their abilities. Word of Clarence's shooting would spread through the armoured divisions like wildfire, not as propaganda but as proof. Proof that the Sherman could do whatever its crew asked of it. Proof that American gunnery was second to none. Proof that the machine everyone had mocked was about to have the last laugh. The battle for Cologne was far from over. German resistance would continue for days, block by block, building by building. But something fundamental had shifted in that moment when Clarence's first shot found its mark. The Sherman tank had finally shed its reputation as a compromise and emerged as what it had always been capable of becoming. A precision instrument of war, limited only by the skill and courage of the men who operated it. The word spread faster than German retreat orders. Within hours of the Cologne engagement, radio chatter across the European theatre carried a single message that changed everything. The Sherman shoots straight. Tank crews who had spent months cursing their equipment suddenly found themselves re-examining their assumptions. Maintenance sergeants who had dismissed the stabilisation system as unreliable began teaching proper cleaning procedures. Commanders who had relied on overwhelming numbers started thinking about precision instead. At 3rd Army headquarters, General Patton received the combat footage with characteristic directness. He watched Clarence's shots 3 times, then turned to his staff with a grin that could have powered a radio transmitter. "Gentlemen," he said, "it appears our tanks have been underestimated." Including by us. Within days, new training protocols were being distributed to armoured units across the front. Not just gunnery techniques, but maintenance procedures, crew coordination, target acquisition methods that maximise the Sherman's technological advantages. The transformation rippled through the ranks like a shockwave. Tank crews who had accepted 50% casualty rates as inevitable suddenly realised they had been fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. The stabiliser systems they had ignored were cleaned, calibrated, and put back into service. Loaders practiced ammunition handling until they could feed shells in their sleep. Gunners studied German armour diagrams like medical students memorising anatomy charts. Technical Sergeant Bill Crawford embodied this new attitude. His crew had lost 2 tanks in the Hurtgen forest, casualties of ambushes that seemed unavoidable at the time. But after seeing Clarence's footage, Crawford began analysing every engagement differently. The angles of approach, the positioning of his tank, the split-second timing that separated survival from disaster. He realised they hadn't been unlucky. They had been unprepared. Crawford's next engagement came during the crossing of the Roer River. German defenders had prepared killing zones with interlocking fields of fire, designed to channel American attacks into predetermined ambush sites. Traditional tactics would have meant accepting heavy casualties while infantry cleared the positions house by house. Instead, Crawford requested permission to try something different. His Sherman advanced alone, using the stabiliser system to engage targets while moving at maximum speed. The first shot took out a Panzerfaust team at 300 yards, while the tank was doing 20 miles per hour over rough terrain. The second eliminated an anti-tank gun before its crew could traverse onto target. By the time German defenders realised what was happening, Crawford had destroyed half their positions and opened a corridor for the following infantry. The mathematics of tank warfare were changing. Where American crews had once relied on numerical superiority to overwhelm German positions, they now possessed something more valuable than numbers. They had precision. They had confidence. They had the knowledge that their equipment was capable of anything they asked it to do, provided they understood how to ask properly. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison commanded a battalion of Shermans during the final push toward Berlin. His after-action reports from March 1945 read like technical manuals written by poets. The tank, he wrote, has evolved beyond its original specifications through the accumulated wisdom of crews who refused to accept limitations as permanent conditions. His units were reporting kill ratios that defied conventional wisdom. Single Shermans engaging multiple German vehicles and emerging victorious not through luck, but through systematic application of superior technique. The German response was telling. Intelligence intercepts from late March showed Wehrmacht commanders struggling to understand what had changed in American armoured tactics. The enemy tanks are firing with unprecedented accuracy, one report noted. Previous assessments of Sherman capabilities appear to have been severely understated. Another transmission, intercepted near Dresden, was even more revealing. American gunners are achieving first-round hits at ranges we considered impossible for their weapons. Recommend immediate withdrawal from all exposed positions. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. British tank crews, who had initially dismissed American gunnery as adequate but uninspired, began requesting cross-training opportunities. They wanted to understand how Sherman crews were achieving results that exceeded their own Fireflies and Churchills. The student had become the teacher, and the lesson was simple. Technology without technique is just expensive metal. Technique without understanding is just repetition. But understanding combined with proper technique could turn any weapon into an instrument of surgical precision. That footage of Clarence Smoyer's perfect shots in Cologne became more than newsreel material. It became proof that the Sherman tank was never the problem. The crews who learned to unlock its potential, who trusted its technology, who understood that precision beats power every single time, they turned a machine the world had written off into the deadliest tank destroyer of the war. The critics fell silent. The mockery stopped. And in the end, it wasn't German engineering that won tank battles. It was American marksmanship.